Good afternoon, everyone. It's 1:40, so I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. My name is Paul Zanazanian, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Integrated Studies and Education at McGill University, and I am one of our department's History Social Studies educators. And I'm accompanied here today by Professor Sabrina Moisan, who also is an associate professor at Université Sherbrooke in the Department of Pedagogy. Perfect. So welcome, Sabrina. So before we start, I'd like to make a few opening comments. So I'd like to welcome all the participants to the Education and Vitality Forum. And I would like to indicate that it is an event of the Interlevel Educational Table ILET, which is a committee of Concordia University's Quebec English-speaking Communities Research Network, QUESCREN. I would also like to acknowledge the funding for the event. The forum is supported by the Secrétariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise. So I'd like to welcome everybody to something that's been part of my own thinking for quite a while now. Our panels, the title of our panel is "Are Teachers Who Teach History in English Language Schools Key for Vitalizing English-speaking Quebec?" As a researcher interested in how everyday people use history for living their lives, or history in the service of practical life, I'm really interested in this link between historical knowledge and social change, or this link between historical knowledge and our ability to help groups vitalize themselves. So it's an interesting puzzle that that Sabrina and I are inviting you to join us today. So I'd like to articulate the puzzle and start my presentation. How can we use history to help maintain a minority that was a former dominant group and that has a contentious history, and people still perceive that group as being associated with a dominant group in the past, and that group is now a sociological minority but is in decline and is increasingly diverse. So the puzzle is, how can we use history to help vitalize English-speaking Quebec in a win-win manner for all? The title of my talk is "How English-speaking History Teachers Position Themselves and Integrate English-speaking Youth into Quebec Society," how they position themselves in light of Quebec's ongoing history programs. Okay, so I'll start off by setting the stage. So the English-speaking communities of Quebec represent a new sociological minority that emerged as a result of the language laws of the 1970s in Quebec. Now, there are two main, I guess, characteristics of this community, if we can say that today. And one of them is this quest for legitimacy, especially among community leaders, a quest to be able to speak on behalf of the community's differing subgroups, and also to speak and be legitimate in the eyes of Quebec's Francophone majority, which represent a fragile minority, in the words of Professor Mary McAndrew, in Quebec. So Francophones represent a minority within North America, and English speakers represent a minority within a minority, but if they identify as Canadian, they kind of immediately are associated with the majority group. So in light of this quest for legitimacy, there's the idea of multiple and fluid identities as well. So it's hard to label a group. As soon as we give a label or identity to someone to define that person, we're immediately inadvertently excluding others. So it's this interesting challenge for community leaders, this quest for legitimacy. And the other quest is that there's the one for community vitality. How can a group, it refers to a group's ability to regenerate and maintain itself in a distinct and autonomous manner, while also being respective of other groups that share the same territorial unit. Now, let's go to the next slide. So just to provide more context, to varying degrees, Quebec's historic communities tend to perceive themselves as either a majority and minority, as either being marginalized, silenced, and or privileged. And even Francophones and Anglophones to a certain extent can identify themselves as being marginalized. So what factors come into play? Well, the memories of British imperialism for practically all groups, histories of unequal power relations between the differing groups that have settled this land over the years. Also the lingering effects of colonization, both English and French colonization, and the ongoing systematic racism that still is present in Quebec and in other North American societies, and that have a negative effect on people of First Nations and background, and on Blacks and other marginalized groups. So amidst all this dynamic context, you have English and French speakers who are also seeking to maintain and regenerate themselves. And their ongoing mutual challenges and struggles have nonetheless come to create a strong linguistic binary: English versus French. Everything, even the history program, is seen as English versus French. And this lends to even silencing the needs of Quebec's Indigenous, Black, and other marginalized groups in terms of recognizing their realities, their experiences, or even in terms of having them be able to voice their grievances. The elevated level of identity politics in Quebec has the effect of worsening the situation for marginalized groups. So now the vitality challenge for the English-speaking communities of Quebec across its wide diversity of realities and experiences is to engage individuals who self-identify as English-speaking and Quebecois in ways that are meaningful to them, but that also foster feelings of commonality, the sense of commonality, connectivity, and control over their common situation as English speakers, and a sense of success in their ability to make positive change for their community. So these are the ideas that I've gotten from Weber, Bandura, and also Bachataria. So the guiding question for my presentation is today, because we're looking at history teachers, given their positions of power and influence, what role do English language history teachers play in enacting legitimacy and vitality for the English-speaking communities of Quebec? So when it comes to teaching, just a bit more context, it's kind of difficult, and this is going to come out from the data that I'm going to share with you today. So Quebec's national history program, especially the current one, can be seen as a difficult history to teach. From the perspective of English speakers and minority groups, there exists a lack of adequate representation and nuance, both of which leave the impression that Quebec's English-speaking communities, Quebec's own cultural and historical experiences don't really matter, and that their presence as a group instead forms a threat to Francophone's survival as a nation, both in terms of language and culture. So this is the general idea that emerges from the data, but also from conversations with everyday teachers, history teachers, and so forth. So they would like, I guess the idea would be to see a history from their own perspective, their own, I guess, internal identity, where they are the protagonists of their story, and that is what's lacking. And then in reinforcing the knowledge acquisition of the main markers of the Francophone majority's lived realities and experiences, the end-of-year mandatory June exam inadvertently perhaps amplifies these sentiments, because students are then faced with having to articulate and validate the negative depictions of the English-speaking communities and of their exclusion and unwantedness. So it's not necessarily a comfortable situation for history teachers to be in. So I'm drawing data from a study that took place after the introduction of the new history program. And the study specifically examines how 16 teachers who self-identify as English-speaking and who teach the History of Quebec and Canada program in English language schools across the province, how they position themselves regarding the program's exclusionary nature and how they consequently work to integrate their students into broader society. So it's part of that puzzle. It's a tough task. So just to give you some general themes, all the teachers in the study, and Sabrina is going to talk about this also through her data and in other data that I've gathered over the years, teachers mainly find the history program to be problematic. At a general level, they find that the program provides simplified and static representations of reality. The program, especially the current one, reinforces dichotomous understandings of English and French speakers. And there's also a lack of resonance, and thus the program is unrelatable for marginalized and minority students. More than half of the teachers explicitly believe that this lack of representation is deliberate. The program, they believe, is misleading, inaccurate, misrepresentative, and expressly biased. The program, some argue even further, saying that it feeds into the political status quo, which satisfies certain interest groups, or that it reinforces a nationalist vision of Quebec where Francophones are seen as victims and survivors. And one teacher out of the whole group went a little further and said that it's a form of getting revenge on English speakers for what the English speakers did to Francophones in the past. So there's this general, these are the general themes that people, the teachers in the study, identify as what makes the program difficult or problematic. Now, to counter such feelings of exclusion and rejection, all the teachers in the study want their students to see their own histories. They really want students to connect with the material and to get a joy out of studying history and to see a reflection of their own experiences so that they feel like they belong. So some teachers provide general guidelines for what should be done, and this is nothing new. They want more minority perspectives, more context and space for critical thinking. Some of them even mention that reality is complex, so why don't we represent reality as something that is complex with many gray areas and not necessarily in black and white simplistic terms as they find the program currently does. Again, more than half of the teachers go beyond just stating what should be done, and they claim to be more proactive. And then they state how they nuance and rectify what is presented to students and what they do to empower them to question, criticize, and unmask the program's perceived suppressive master narrative. And some teachers do this. They work really hard, and they do this by focusing on local history, family history, field trips, and guest speakers. So they make room for minority experiences or the experiences of their marginalized students through these different facets. Okay, where's my arrow? There it is. So I'm going to present the data of two teachers. They're both articulate, Jamie and Diane, and they provide a lot of deep insight into the situation, into the problems with the current program and the avenues they adopt to help make room for their students. And I'm going to bring them together at the end, which is something interesting. They have some interesting insight also for this whole question of, can history teachers really help vitalize English-speaking Quebec? So at the time of the study, Jamie was 45 years old. He's originally from Ontario. He identifies himself as Canadian, and he's originally from the British Isles, the greater region of the British Isles. He's been in Quebec for 23 years. His mother tongue, his first official language spoken both in, and the language he speaks both inside and outside his home is English. And he's taught history across secondary 1, 2, 3, and 4. And he's also taught contemporary world in Sec 5. So he's a seasoned history teacher, and he teaches in a low socioeconomic neighborhood, and his classroom is multicultural. Now, in terms of his historical memory, what's interesting is that he uses what I call a reversal schematic narrative template. And this is the same template that emerges among my study with community leaders. And this is very common. So a template is basically a core narrative structure that underlies and guides the thinking of how we remember the history, and in this case, the history of his community. And the reversal template is that English speakers started off in a positive position, then whoops, with the Quiet Revolution, what's positive becomes negative. So there's this reversal of fortune of sorts. But what's interesting about Jamie is that he kind of stands out. So he adopts this reversal schematic template, but instead of saying it's from, instead of focusing on the English as a whole, irrespective of their diversity, this reversal is from an English-speaking elite, like that business elite dominating, and others, including English speakers, resisting this elite to no longer dominating. So it's not just English versus French, but rather an English elite versus poor working class Anglophones, women, labor unions, French, Irish, Jews, Blacks, until the Quiet Revolution transforms things, with those who are unhappy leaving and those who are open to the changes remaining. So following the procedure, I adopted Letourneau and Moisan, Sabrina's here with us today, their methodology for this part of the study. And the one-liner that we ask at the end to recite the whole history in one line is, he states, "It is the story, English-speaking Quebec's history is the story of an extremely diverse community whose members have played a wide range of roles throughout Quebec's history: assimilator, assimilated, bourgeoisie, and proletariat, majority, minority, colonial authority, and rebel." So but however, when asked about identity labels, remember we said a label gives a name, a word, a meaning, but at the same time it excludes. So it's really contentious. He says that he sees no difference between English-speaking Quebec and Anglo-Quebec. Since an Anglo is an English speaker, he sees no difference. Now I'm going to give a bit of his in-class strategy. Every year, he says, for making change. Every year, he says, I've taught the secondary 4 class. There are several points in the program where I ask students to stop and critically reflect on the curriculum before them. One such point is the first phase of industrialization. When we get to this topic, I ask students 2 questions. Who does the textbook indicate were the factory bosses? They all quickly respond, the English. Who does the textbook indicate were the factory workers? After searching several pages, the students respond that the textbook doesn't say who they were. These questions usually lead to a class discussion that more often than not takes over whatever I had planned to teach that day. Students are initially quite shocked to learn the fact that in Quebec's earliest industrial working class was composed primarily of Anglophones that had immigrated to Quebec from the British Isles. Students then want to know more, he says. I want to know why it's important that the bourgeoisie was predominantly Anglophone, but not that the proletariat was. This leads to a discussion of the broader nationalist narrative that underlies the program, a narrative that presents Anglophones as a monolithic block of elites there to impede the progress of the Quebec nation at every turn. I usually feel that this is one of the classes I teach all year where students are most engaged. For many, it is the first time that they have considered that the history curriculum could be used as a political tool. This is an empowering discovery for many. In terms of assessing the program at a broader level, he says the problems with the current program run too deep and the content too crowded for individual teachers to address through pedagogical measures alone. Even if Anglo teachers had a lot of supplemental material, there are far too many topics to be covered for the ministry exam to leave room for any supplemental material to be covered. Further, if their history is supplemental, but the nationalist history is the focus of the high stakes exam, the message of second-class citizenship is still being sent. So there's this idea of no matter what kind of tools you bring in, if the master narrative is still the same, and if you're still testing students on the main markers of one group's particular historical memory, not much is going to change. So in a solution, he goes, has to emerge from the curriculum reform process. So he provides some thoughts, which I think are interesting for us to look at today. It should never be driven by lobby groups from either the sovereignist or federal camps when creating history programs. It should be founded on the values of an inclusive democratic society, not narrow views of ethnic nationalism. In other words, it should not merely tell the story of the Quebec nation. It should be more broadly focused on the story of Quebec society. There should be open public consultations where the perspectives of Quebec's various ethnic communities are actively sought out. It is absolutely unacceptable, he continues, that those involved in the last curriculum reform were made to sign a confidentiality agreement preventing them from sharing and discussing the proposals for the new program. Finally, he believes that the stakes of the ministerial exam need to be lower. The only thing this exam accomplishes is kill the love for the subject among students and make teachers feel that they need to always be teaching to the test. Now, when asked whether we need to bring in English-speaking centered pedagogical resources to help vitalize the community, he says, now this is something interesting to keep in mind, regarding the creation and use of specifically designed pedagogical resources as a supplement, we need to make sure that the history of Quebec's various minority communities are not ghettoized in the schools those communities attend. The history of these various communities must be integrated into the program itself. And if there's to be a ministry exam, that content must be evaluated by the exam. Otherwise, we're just further entrenching the two solitudes and building a less cohesive society. That said, the problem should be both inclusive of Quebec's diversity and leave space for the teaching of more local history. So basically what he's arguing for here is that even if we bring in tools, we have to make sure that it's inclusive, because if we try to vitalize English-speaking Quebec, we risk doing so at the expense of minority groups, which is something interesting that we're going to have to think about at the end of our presentation. Diane was 40 years old, spent most of her life in Quebec, 20 years in Montreal. She's of a mixed background, and her mother tongue is English. Her first official language is English, but she speaks both English and Spanish at home and English outside her home. She too has taught history across all secondary levels and is a seasoned teacher. And she also teaches in a multicultural milieu, but the majority of her students are Black Quebecers. So what's interesting about her template is she's not part of the majority of people who have that reversal template, which is common across community leaders and history teachers. But she has this template, what I call multi-form. She's the only one ultimately, where her template says that there are different stories. So it's more complex and it's not that straightforward per se. Like that's the structuring idea that she enters when it comes to reciting her history of English-speaking Quebec. So she offers us a social history with manifold aspects: migration, development, growth, diversity, contributions, discrimination, and resistance. And then she speaks how, she mentions how English speakers are a varied group in her narrative with different experiences and challenges. For Blacks, the challenges are slavery, integration, and racism. For Indigenous peoples, the challenges are alliances with the French and the English, legacies of colonialism, the residential school system, OCA, and deep-rooted French-Canadian racism. And the challenges for English speakers as a whole, she says, is language, loss of institutions, exodus, and reverse discrimination. The one-liner, English speakers were critically important and involved in shaping Quebec history over time on all levels, including culture, industry, society, innovators, social reformers, working class, and human rights. So she really has more of this fluid, well, Jamie too, but her approach is a bit more fluid and makes room for different narratives. But I don't argue that Jamie doesn't do that either, but his template is different. So, and then she too, so whereas Jamie didn't didn't really see a difference between Anglo-Quebec and English-speaking communities of Quebec, and we'll see, because I guess it's not because he doesn't care, it's because I think he has more of an internationalist identity, and he's like we don't need like ethnic identity, we all need to live together. So it's kind of that approach. Diane herself is a Montrealer. So I think we're having elections soon. So the idea of Montreal being a city-state, so this could be encouraging. So Diane identifies as a Montrealer. She goes, I'm an English speaker, but the term Anglo has many negative connotations, and in my opinion is too deeply rooted in negative connotations. Although I'm an English speaker, she prefers to be called a Montrealer and to not be pigeonholed in one box. I am perfectly triangular. I am perfectly trilingual and hope this world be valued and appreciated. So her strategy. So she has a teaching philosophy, and it's really based around inquiry-based learning and project-based learning. Since the inception of my teaching career, she says, I've had the privilege of teaching in the social sciences and have frequently been reminded by peers and colleagues that kids today don't know anything about the world anymore. This assumption has unfortunately been present by the lack of historical material and periods being covered by history textbooks approved by the government. I've always sought to complement out of necessity. So she goes the extra mile, and felt a strong responsibility to expose students to all histories, especially their own, which oftentimes are marginalized or excluded. I am perhaps more sensitive because I'm a child of immigrants, a first-generation Canadian, so always felt excluded myself as a student. Everyone's history stories are important, whether you are dominant or not. More specifically, once I began really looking at the history books we're teaching, I realized it was so little and wondered, and now she's talking, because she has a lot of Black students in her class, and she's talking about Black history and this lack of information on slavery. She was wondering whether this lack of information was just another aspect of Quebec history, which has been molded, and these are her words, to indoctrinate young minds and shape the Quebec nationalist survivor nationalism narrative. What I did was develop, so this is where she takes action, her teacher agency comes into play. What I did was develop through research and activity with pictures, video, and a slideshow of major and minor events in Canadian history of the Black experience, which I show in February. So she doesn't just focus on Black History Month, she goes beyond it because she finds it really non-conducive, like just focusing on 1 month a year. So she's constantly doing it, bringing in Black history, historical experiences. So which I show in February, and then during my teaching all year round, I supplement the material by discussing important moments, anecdotal stories, and characters of Black Canadians have been part of our collective history. She even talks about James McGill owning slaves. This is part of English-speaking Quebec history. It is my hope that through this teaching throughout the year and during Black History Month, that students feel included and see and feel how amazingly interesting history is. So she also has tips. The history program is written and presented in such a way as to indoctrinate and perpetuate the myth that French Canadians are victims, helpless in a sea of English bent on assimilating them. The inclusion in the textbooks of the influence and contributions of all is the first part, include everybody. Second, how is the history written? Is it more objectivity is needed? Careful analysis of the language is needed when writing about historical events and people. 3, activities, debate, role-playing are necessary for students to debate and see many sides of the political, social, and economic issue that have occurred over time. Then also teachers need materials and lessons to allow students to interact with history, rather than memorize the players, or as she says, bloody documents to pass the exam. It cannot be French Canadians versus everybody else. Importance and value must be given to all peoples, whether the majority or minority, no matter the language. Again, when asked about what kind of resources, or if we're to bring in specific resources centered on English-speaking Quebec, her reaction was similar to Jamie's. The history should be an inclusive, same history for all, including perspectives, and not separating into an English sector. My worry is, she says, taking the same path Quebec nationalists took with this reform program, us versus them. Local history is important, including Anglophones and immigrants. Again, local history. By creating a learning path that is English speaker focused, you could run the risk of excluding students and creating the same wrongs as nationalist historians. In my opinion, there should be one history that is all inclusive for English and French students. So this is now coming to our interesting puzzle that we gotta solve. So when you look at theories of ethnicity, group formation, community development, et cetera, a central component is every group, in order to survive in time, needs a usable history, a historical self-definition for imagining collective forms of attachment, for having a sense of connectivity, and for also being able to mobilize the group in a concerted way for concerted social action. So one important way of looking at it could be what Hilton and Liu talk about historical charters, and these are conceptual resources which are really in the form of easily recognizable yet simplified representations of the past that offer groups. It's like historical, like snippets of understandings of pre-given understandings of the historical past that help give a form of moral and political legitimation to groups, especially when group leaders or community leaders use those recognizable representations. And they also help guide political attitudes and group behavior. This is similar to what I've written about before, influenced by Leda Assmann, the idea of political memory. So I argue that English-speaking Quebec currently has more of a generational and social memory, which means that their memory is fluid. It refers to shared memories of everyday people's lived experiences, but that are intergenerational. And eventually, if it doesn't become a political memory or historical charter, it will basically fizzle and no longer be alive. So political memories are more uniform, homogeneous, and explicit. They're devised for transgenerational communication that aim for durability and permanence. They're self-contained and complete, possessing symbolic and material manifestations, and they are imploded and emotionally charged narratives with distinct and stimulating messages. So Francophones have a rich historical self-definition and an ample supply of historical representations. And this really started with, as the story goes, with François-Xavier Garneau, who wrote the history of Canada, he wrote a first history of French Canadians, and since then that has become a historical charter. Like it's come to form a historical consciousness as French speakers in the province, and it's come to underscore the narrative in the history program. So this historical self-definition has helped Francophones maintain their group identity and presence. And as part of the history program, the current reading of it is more of a nationalist and conservative one. Now, Quebec, English-speaking Quebecers, as a new sociological minority, they do not possess an easily recognizable and readily available historical self-definition that can be used to mobilize group members. That's what my argument is. Through my research, my prior research with community leaders and teachers, now I demonstrate that there are the beginning contours of a historical memory, but they don't have necessarily historical heroes or figures or myths. So the definition is still largely in the form of a social generational memory, and it's not really a political one. So considering today's general belief in multiple fluid and intersectional identities, as well as a more global self-awareness, this is our puzzle, and maybe you can help solve it. How can the English-speaking communities of Quebec in all its diversity create a historical charter for action, one that is legitimate in the eyes of its subgroups and Quebec's Francophone majority, and one that can help maintain and regenerate the community in an autonomous and distinct manner? My final slide, I'd like to end with this quote. It's the last part of this article I published in 2019, where I state, questioning English-speaking Quebec's ability to do something similar, i.e. as the Francophones, and create this historical charter that's their political memory, while arguably necessary, may be bold and controversial, especially because of the community's perceived privilege and former colonial history. Irrespective of their past, sensed as good or bad, a core issue nonetheless arises of whether, and this is my question, can self-identifying minorities in democracies, can they survive without a historical narrative? But what I'm saying is whether minorities in democracy should be entitled to access and maintain their own self-declared histories. Can minorities, here it is, actually exist without politicized uses of history for narrating who they are and what they should aspire to? If not, then where does one draw the line? How can potential dangers be overcome when forms of group attachment developed for providing coherency and guidance can easily simplify reality and limit openness to others who happen to be different? So that's it. I'll stop sharing my screen. Thank you for listening to me. So that's basically the challenge. That's the puzzle. So Sabrina, je te donne, I give you the virtual floor. Thank you.
So my presentation won't be as long as Paul's because, well, he gave us a background, a theoretical background that I will try to build on. I'm presenting data from a research project we are conducting together, Paul, I, and a few other researchers on the question of including the plurality of historical experiences in the teaching and representation of Quebec, Canada's past. The title of this presentation is Francophone and Anglophone History Teachers Facing the Plurality of Historical Experiences. And I didn't know about the difference between English-speaking and Anglophone. I didn't know that. So sorry, I don't want to offend anybody with the use of Anglophone. So what I present is really preliminary results. It's not as achieved as what Paul just presented, and you will see that there are many same things, so I won't repeat them. So I would like just to, what I did is that I analyzed the data we collected, and I focused on the discourses on English-speaking Quebec and Canada. So very fastly, I will present the research project. So the main question is why and how to represent the plurality of historical experiences in the teaching of Quebec and Canada history. It's a comprehensive qualitative inquiry, which our goals are really to try to identify the spectrum of postures and arguments. Why should we do that and how? There are some people who would say, no, not really, and others would say, yeah, of course. Most of the people would say, yes, of course, but then when they say yes, of course, they also add some conditions and limits to that. So we are trying to figure out what are the main postures, to identify also the differences and similarities between historians and history teachers. So we did interviews with 22 historians, 21 history teachers, and also 3 public historians, which are people mainly working in museums and who are in charge of building exhibitions about the Quebec past. Quebec's past.
Sabrina,
yes.
There's a comment, if you could put it in presentation mode so we can see the PowerPoint.
Sure.
Yeah,
yes.
Perfect.
Okay.
Sorry for interrupting.
No, it's okay. Thank you. And then as we are educators, we also want to provide new models for teachers training, how to include plurality of experiences and perspective in the history class. So, I jump right away in the results, and here on these slides we have the results that are common to teachers, no matter their language. And so all of them said that it's important to add, or they want to add more content into the actual history, Quebec and Canada history program, according to the identity of their students. They believe that, well, most of the teachers everywhere in the province, they have students from different identities and they want to talk to them. And to do so, well, they have to add content and they feel like they have to start from scratch because there is not much in the school books, in the program. And so while they do that, they go here and there and they produce new narratives. I don't have time to go too much into that today, but this is something I want to explore more and see what are these narratives that are being created by teachers who are not historians necessarily. They also have the challenge, well, to integrate multiple perspectives. And they say, well, if I'm not native or I'm not Anglophone, how can I present the perspective from that point of view? And so they try to focus more on facts, or they will simply reproduce collective and cultural memory. And so I felt like teachers rely on themselves and on their own sense of history and historical experience to present the different perspectives. They won't go, they won't have the reflex to go and find more, I don't know, documents, historical documents that could help them present other perspectives, even if they will, like Paul said, invite speakers in their classroom and so on, but they feel like they have the responsibility to, to know or to feel by themselves what it meant to be or to experience history from a certain perspective. So I have to move this. So here's one who says, I would think the challenge is probably myself, a lack of real knowledge of that perspective, of that experience. I mean, I know the historical facts of it, but because I haven't lived it, I would think that, I mean, a couple of years ago, what was it called? Sorry, I didn't really, it was a training, so the blanket training on Indigenous history in Canada. I'm not sure what that was, and that was excellent, like that was fantastic. And that was a really neat thing and I didn't do it this year with my students, and they often do it in grade 9, but that was neat, and it was easy because teachers could just say, hey, I'll book it at this period, and it just gave the kids a real interesting perspective. So I would think more of those kind of access to information and resources, and people would be helpful for sure. So that's a way to integrate other perspectives that teachers from every language group would say. Now, the results with Francophone history teachers when they're facing the Anglophone historical experience. What I found interesting is that there is in the data we found an undiscussed discrepancy between the representation of the past and the present. The French-speaking teachers all seems to say, and some say very clearly, that in present time, there is no tension between Anglophone and Francophone in Quebec, that we have now pacific relationships. But nevertheless, when they teach history, they focus on tensions and conflicts between Anglophone and Francophones, or English Canadians and French Canadians and so on. The program is built this way, as Paul said, but they don't discuss the fact that it might be difficult to understand for students why, like if the present is not problematic, conflictual, then, why do we focus on conflicts in the past? So they don't really see that there are problems in the present. And then I tried to see, well, who are the Anglophones or the English-speaking communities in the Francophone perspective. And so what I found is that it's quite monolithic, although we have few groups that are named, like les Anglais, the English Canadians, the British, the Americans, mainly the Loyalists, and the Canadian government, which is in the same package deal of the Anglophones, the other by excellence. And inside the group, there are also sometimes named the Irish, the Scottish, and the English. And I made these plus because the Irish seem to have a narrative that exists, and teachers would teach a lot about the Irish experience in the past, immigration experience, the quarantine, and yeah, there are many examples of what they would say about the Irish. The Scottish, not much, and the English, we have no idea what is their specific experience. And the Anglophone is perceived by the French-speaking history teachers as culturally homogeneous. There is no inclusion of ethnocultural diversity when teachers talk about the Anglophones. and they of course they are there. In the history program, the English speaking group is there always, and teachers try to present both sides of the stories, but they won't go into really presenting the history from the perspective of the Anglophones. So we have one here that says, La diversité, I hope it's okay if I read in French. If not, you just have to wave and we can translate. La diversité à l'intérieur de l'histoire du Canada et du Québec, c'est toujours cette confrontation-là entre anglophones et francophones qui est moins présente aujourd'hui, mais qui est là dans notre cours, ça c'est sûr. Entre anglophones et francophones, entre la pauvreté des Canadiens français puis les riches Canadiens anglais ou les Britanniques ou les Américains. Il y a ça, il y a côté urbain-rural, la compétition, la religion, mais tout pour moi, la religion et rural, ça va avec Canadiens français. And the same teachers here. J'aimerais ça pouvoir dire à mes élèves quand j'enseigne l'incendie du Parlement, oui, je leur dis pourquoi les Anglais étaient choqués, mais cette haine-là, elle n'est pas née là, le soir où ils ont mis le feu. J'aimerais ça pouvoir leur dire vraiment ou leur faire ressentir c'est quoi. Je leur fais bien plus ressentir la colère qu'on a eue. Ça, je suis capable, je la sens du côté des Canadiens français, mais une chicane, ça se fait toujours à deux. So you can see how history is lived, and they have to feel it, like I said in the previous slide. This is another quote that is interesting, I find. Tous les nouveaux groupes d'immigrants qui sont arrivés à cette époque-là, on parle de la Révolution tranquille des années 60, qui ne se considéraient pas Canadiens-anglais ni Canadiens-français, qui arrivent là, qui essayent de s'intégrer dans la société. Et si on parle juste des Canadiens français qui soudainement ont une identité québécoise puis qui deviennent des Québécois, bien souvent, on a tendance à oublier qu'il y avait probablement aussi des immigrants qui se sentaient québécois. So this quote shows how the idea of Québécois here is only for French Canadians. And the teacher says, well, probably some immigrants would also feel Québécois, and we have to pay attention to that, to be sensitive. But she would never say that English Canadians are also Québécois. And looking through the interviews, I could not find the use of Anglo-Québécois or something similar like English-speaking communities in Quebec. It doesn't seem to exist as a concept. Then in the interviews with Anglophone history teachers and the representation of their own historical experience in history teaching, there I feel a sense that they have a sense that Anglophones are still discriminated against and wrongly represented in the history program today. They feel like they are misunderstood regarding the past and the present. So they are misrepresented in the program, but they're also mistreated in the present. So that's a big difference with the Francophone teachers. When I try to find what does it mean to be like this English Canada or Anglophone in their discourse, the answers are quite different. It's very diverse. It covers the Canadian experience, province to province. They talk about Anglo-Quebec more specifically, the experience in Quebec. They also have this Irish, Scottish, English loyalist categories, and they will also talk much more about the Irish experience and a little bit also about the loyalists, but nothing about the English experience. And the main difference is that they include also a vast ethnocultural diversity. They would talk about Black history, Black communities' history as being part of the Anglophone or English-speaking experience. Also, Indigenous would be included in this category, which is very, very different from the Francophone perspectives. And in doing so, then they also feel this otherness and sameness. So they are, I would say they are used to deal with complexity with these categories a little bit more than the French-speaking teachers. And in their posture for teaching history, I say they play the role of the peacekeepers, because they say that often students would come in their classroom and they're angry, they don't understand why Bill 101 and so on. And so they will try to present the Francophone perspective, why these laws were there, and to calm them down and to help them understand the society as it is, and why it was made this way. And they also include a lot of content to make sure that these students build a sense of belonging in the society. So I'll go a bit faster. I will pass this one. And so I come back with all the teachers together. What I found in the data is that if we consider this triangle, teachers, students, in history, the parts that are marked with the arrows are the parts of the past that seems to be more meaningful for history teachers, because they allow to see oneself there in the past. And one teacher says it quite properly. I mean, at the end of the day, history should somehow validate students' own experiences and help them to find meaning in their existence on this planet. And we're not doing that if they don't see themselves in the history course, and if their stories and the stories of their ancestors are not there, or if they are there, maybe they're kind of whitewashed. So very fastly, because to answer the question, are Francophone history teachers agents for English-speaking communities' vitality? That's a question we could ask. The identity of their students is the most important thing for them to decide what they will include in the history classroom in terms of content. The problem is that Francophone teachers have little or no contact with students from the English-speaking minority. And also their experiences, they're very stuck, I would say, in their own Francophone perspective on history. And one way to help would be to create spaces where Francophone teachers can meet English-speaking students and teachers and make them more aware of English-speaking community of Quebec issues and perspectives. And are the Anglophone history teachers agents? I would say that by acting as peacemakers and by working on building students' positive historical consciousness, they might contribute to create a sense of belonging, to foster social cohesion, and to make room for a real understanding between the linguistic groups in Quebec. So I think they already play a big role, but we would need to go and see maybe further what are the results of their teaching with the students. Voilà.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. That was very interesting. So we have 11 minutes. So hello, Emily. Thank you for your questions. So I know this is not in the scope of your research, but do you have any thoughts on how these findings can tie into the introduction of the controversial? Yes. So the way I would answer this now is that people tend to forget that what French Canadian nationalists are trying to do is part of this wave of social justice measures, that's what I argue, since the 60s to help make room for Francophones. So people might not think because that Francophones are seeking social justice because they're in a majority position, more or less, but in a way they are, because they're still a fragile majority. But the flip side of social justice is a form of nationalism, where people become a bit more maybe extreme in their views. And I argue that this is not just the case for Francophones or Anglophones, but even for marginalized groups, where people are seeking social justice, but the flip side could be. So if you look at it from this perspective, this new course is because there's this fear that the French culture and language is dying, and there's this need to bring in social justice measures to either remind Francophones of who they are, and to also tell other minorities of who French Quebecers are. So there's this social justice perspective. I know Sabrina has more insider information perhaps than me regarding the new, because the ECR course has been removed, ERC course.
About the new course,
Yeah,
culture and Quebec citizenship.
And how what we talked about relates to it. I know it's not part of our research per se, but I took the social justice angle, saying that there's this fear and need to remind people of.
Yeah, I wouldn't know how to frame that. I mean, I was the minister press conference, and he talked about the Quebec nation and how like it's Quebec culture that is the main focus. And someone asked, what about Indigenous culture? It was part of the old program, and the minister said, well, Indigenous culture is part of Quebec culture. So, and then later he talked about Quebec nation. And so it's clearly a project of, well, according to his interpretation of the new program, it seems to be a nation building program which will foster Quebec identity as it is understood by this government. But I don't have any secrets I can share more than that.
Okay. So, all right, we have a few more minutes. Let me just go see some questions. There are some comments that Deb and Emily made. How might teachers transcend a narrow content-driven approach teaching history and consider critical thinking and broader perspectives? So yes, so it's a very good question, and I think those are questions that teachers in the field have to constantly ask themselves, Deb. And it's even harder given the end of year June exam, where the stakes, students have to have a good grade. In some schools, like if they don't do well, students don't do well, certain teachers can risk losing their jobs. Well, the approach that these proactive teachers in my data use is basically bringing in local history, family history. They also use like critical thinking techniques. They do little field trips. So it's a way of like decentering or trying to show how reality is gray, while the narrative itself may give a black and white understanding of the historical past. Sabrina?
Yeah, I think if I understand properly, the idea would be to reflect on what is history as a construction. I think we need really to make that clear in the history classroom, that it is not something that is given and that is true. It is a construction, it is interpretation, and it is power relation. And you have to make that clear to students, I think, and to show, like Jamie, the teacher you presented, is doing something like that, to question the school book and the narrative that are offered everywhere, how people use history to promote their group. And I think like it's some kind of literacy about what is history that needs to be there, because we will never be able to include everybody in the and the nuance that we would like to. So, but nevertheless, we have to try. We have to give more narratives, alternative narratives, that to help the students to understand history from different perspectives. And also a reflection on the discipline. Yeah.
Deb, I don't know if you're a teacher, but there's this concept that's used in Sweden called use of history. So here we talk about historical thinking, and use of history brings in more of a sociological, anthropological, and to some extent even political understanding of how history is used in different societies and for what purposes. and it's kind of it's organized in an easy to understand and apply a method. So it's use of history, and one of the main authors is Kenneth Nordgren. If ever you're interested in doing more reading, I don't know if you're a teacher, but it kind of complements what Sabrina just said, and but in a more practical way.
There is a question from Richard Bourris, and I think it's important here. It's asking if Francophone and Anglophone history teachers meet in conferences. Not too much. There was the conference from the SPHQ, the Société des professeurs d'histoire du Québec, in Quebec City last week, and there were 100 people, and the guest speaker asked, is there one Anglophones here, because he was saying something that was not cool at all. And there was a guy, just one person said, yeah. And then the guest speaker said, okay, so I won't say what I was going to say. Okay, they don't meet too much. I would say that from what I could see in our data, and I mean, Paul and I are doing research for 10 years on this subject now, and that it's always the same, and I think that as the system is divided Francophone and linguistically, and Francophone and Anglophone, I feel like Francophone teachers feel like they feel legitimate to present the French-speaking perspective, and perhaps the Anglophone do the same. I don't know, but you know, there is lack of connection there, and a lack of mutual understanding, or at least from the French-speaking perspective, for sure. And I think we need more of these spaces. Like we can organize exchange with other provinces, but we could do that here. Two classrooms from two linguistic groups. They have to meet. There have been in the past, yeah. Yeah,
it's again, it's like we always tell, you know, we always teach racism is bad, but then racism still exists. You know, like it's one of those issues where we're recreating the wheel and trying to, you know, and we do great initiatives, and people do appreciate. I guess we just have to do more of it, or we should maintain it and not just do it for a little period and then forget about it. Maybe it should be more integrated. I don't know. That's an interesting point. Yeah. So thank you so much. It's good to see everyone. Good to see Richard and Janine. It's been a long time. Nice to see you, Natalina and Emily. Thank you for your comments.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sabrina.
Thank you,
Mark.